Imagine a world where your family is starving. Through malnutrition you can no longer work, and without work you can't provide a home for your children. Imagine a world where your homestead is torn down around you because you can't pay the rent. Imagine a world where you seek shelter at the side of the road in one of the worst winters in decades without a coat or a blanket. Imagine a world where your parents and babies are too weak to fight infection and succumb to epidemic diseases. Imagine a world where you're forced to bury your loved ones without a coffin or a shroud in a mass burial pit. Imagine watching your child board a ship, knowing that you'll never see them again. This is not an imaginary world. This was Ireland during the famine.
You have no idea to the extent to which the west and south of Ireland have been totally ruined. There is nobody left. Well, immediately before the famine, from 1800 onwards, when the Act of Union was passed, we had the landlord system in operation here. So most of the people were tenants, and they had a very frugal existence. They had a very basic existence where they just farmed a small plot, grew potatoes, and pretty much survived on that. So it was rather, for much of the tenantry, it was a subsistence existence. Then as the effect of, just depending on the potato, had a double effect. Because potatoes were so easily grown in the Irish conditions, the damp, moist conditions favoured their growth. It allowed for a population explosion. So the population of Ireland from the Act of Union to 1841 rose from about 3 million to 8.5 million. So a huge population explosion. So therefore there was a huge pressure. So in the west of Ireland, and indeed Ireland in general, after the Act of Union and the Parliament was dissolved in Dublin, many of the major landowners moved to London, and the job of collecting the rents was left to agents, and sometimes agents would have sublet and sublet so that holdings got smaller and smaller as families got bigger. So because of the potato, it allowed for a huge expansion in not just the population, but in the size of families, particularly in the West. So a huge congestion. So even if the famine hadn't occurred at all, a social explosion would have to happen anyway. So something major was going to happen. It turned out to be the potato blight was the trigger. I think it's worth to make the point that the social scene in Ireland was different than in England, but we didn't have an industrial revolution. So there simply was no work. So they depended very much on a benevolent landlord if they were lucky. And he, as was often the case, would divide out the work on a part-time basis so that tenants were taken into the estate, into the domain to do private work for the landlord. And if we had a good landlord, he would do it in a fair and systematic manner. But by and large, there was no work. Well, generally the onset of the famine is marked by the arrival of the potato blight, Phytophthora infestans, to Ireland in autumn 1845. And as I said to you, the main potato growing areas are people surviving mainly on potatoes was in the west of Ireland, and by September it had spread. It hadn't a huge impact on the crop. I think it was down by about 15% But it did frighten the people, and the government got the police, the RIC, to carry out reports to the extent of the impact of it, and some of them are quite interesting. One of the reports states that the people didn't know what was happening as their potato, lovely green leaves, turned to yellow and then to brown and then to black. As a matter of fact, a faction of Lord John Russell's government believed this was good for Ireland, that it would put manners on them and improve their morals and so on. So the initial response in 1846 was Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister, bought Indian corn, £100,000 worth from England, and he set up, from Canada, set up corn depots at strategic positions, 15 of them around the country, so close to water, so there was excess in places like Westport and Banagher and so on, a lot of them around the coast, and that was used to feed the people. In parallel, local relief committees were set up. They generally raised local funds that were to be matched by the Exchequer, and their function then was that was sent to the Relief Commission in Dublin, and public works were initiated to keep the people, give them something to do. As well as that, then lots of agencies and charitable organisations set up soup kitchens. The most notable would have been the Quakers, probably, and while they did phenomenal work in the late months of 1846, they became totally overwhelmed, and they closed down their soup kitchens at the end. But the government thought it was quite a useful idea, so they themselves instituted soup kitchens in early 47, and then they shut down the public works. So they brought some relief at one point, but took it away in the other. And of course, at this stage, the workhouse system became totally overwhelmed, and up to this, the workhouse system had been using indoor relief, and then they started to think about outdoor relief. One of the problems that happened from the landlord's perspective is that some smart landlords were able to get their tenants in to get relief in the workhouse system and abused it to some extent. And a landlord, William Gregory from Coole Park, Lady Gregory's husband, isn't it? Yeah. He brought forward a piece of legislation known as the Gregory Clause, or Quarter Acre Clause, which stated that anyone who had more than a quarter acre of land couldn't get any relief from the workhouse system. You're either a farmer or a pauper. So this opened the floodgates for less conscientious landlords to evict, and that's when the workhouse system became totally overflooded and overwhelmed and couldn't cope, and mass immigration. And of course, if we move on to 48, then what follows when you have overcrowding in workhouses is you have disease follows. Couldn't afford coffins for them, so many of them were buried in mass graves, and there's lots of examples of 600 people, for example, in a workhouse in Swinford were buried without shroud or coffin or anything resembling normality. So that as a result of the famine, the entire population was brought from 8.5 million down to about 6. And as O'Graw, the historian, says, 1/4 of the Irish population either went to the New World or the next world. That was the impact of it.
The workhouse itself, it was the last resort of the destitute poor in Ireland. There were 163 in Ireland, and as an institution, they've been described as the most hated and feared institution in Ireland ever. By the 1800s, our population was a little over 5 million, and it was estimated at that stage that there were some 2.3 million people at near starvation level. And the thing about the workhouse system is, you know, people had to come in here and live here. It was a system of indoor relief. And if you remember what I said, there was a population of some 8 million people. The workhouse system, 130 workhouses set up before the famine years, was built to cater for about 80,000 people. So when the potato blight really failed in 1846, I mean, there was no way the sums were going to add up. Huge starvation on the inside, and a system that was set up to cater for 80,000 people. So of course at that stage things were so bad on the outside that people flocked to the workhouses, and in many cases they didn't get in many cases they didn't even make it as far as the workhouse. You know, they might have had to walk maybe 18, 20 miles to the nearest workhouse whilst they were, you know, suffering from disease and starvation. And the pathway to the workhouse was often called just Casan na Marav, or the pathway of death. Life in the workhouse, it was particularly harsh. When people came in, they would have been met with by either the master or the matron. They were kitted out then in a very coarse grey workhouse uniform. And at that stage, they would have been admitted to the workhouse, and one of the cruelest aspects really was that family members were split up. So boys went to one building, girls to another, men to another, women to another. Children, if they were aged 2 or less, they were allowed to stay with their mother. But if they were older, if they were 3 or more, they were separated from their mothers. Death in the workhouse during the bad years was just a way of life. Deaths were so numerous that huge burial pits were just dug in the workhouse grounds and bodies thrown in. And if we think about it, like even the poorest of the poor prior to the famine years would have had a wake of 2 or 3 days. You know, burial is so important for people. But they were just thrown in largely without coffins into huge burial pits and maybe covered with lime to stop the disease going down. And like if we think of, with 130 workhouses built to cater for 80,000 people, we had millions of people starving. The town I'm from myself, it's Loughrea in County Galway. The workhouse there was built to cater for 800 people, but in actual fact there was over 3,000. Yeah, the death of the overcrowding was just huge, and I don't think we can imagine, you know, what it might have been like with, you know, maybe 3,000 starving, dying people in the one location, and people going mad and wailing, and the stench because sanitation was poor and conditions were poor. No, it doesn't really bear thinking about at all. So, well, the workhouse was called the workhouse because the whole idea was that people would do work in return for food. But the work, in actual fact, it couldn't be productive to any degree because it shouldn't interfere with, you know, commerce outside of the workhouse. And in the early workhouse years, there was a horrible practice in many workhouses where they had this huge big wheel called a capstan wheel. And they just wanted to keep people quiet because at least if they were quiet, they weren't complaining, they weren't fighting, they weren't writing. And people did show spirit as well in the workhouses. But this huge capstan wheel was engaged and it could take up to 100 people to push it around in a circle. Sometimes it was attached to an implement to grind corn, but in other times it was just used to knock the life out of people, really. So life in the workhouse, it was harsh and it was disciplined and it was boring. And there were loads of rules. You had to wash properly, you couldn't be disobedient to a staff member. God forbid if you happened to go into another inmate's quarters. Like, not only were there separate buildings for the boys, the girls, the men and the women, but there were also separate yards, so people couldn't cross over during the day. And if you were in breach of any of these rules, there were what's known as refractory wards, or the inmates, as the people in the workhouse were called, they just called them the dark rooms. So there were literally small stone cells with a stone bed, no light getting in. And if you were out of order, you could be put into one of those for up to 48 hours. But in terms of, you know, people, what hope had they? I mean, had they any hope when they came into these places that they might be able to get out again? The one way was through immigration. And at the time in England, and in Ireland indeed, there was a shortage of timber for building, because there had been the Industrial Revolution and because of various wars. So the timber companies, they looked to North America and Canada for timber supplies. So the ships were going out empty and they were bringing back timber for construction. So the shipping companies got wise then and they thought, hold on a sec, we could be maybe making a few quid here. So they went around to the workhouses selling cheap passage to North America and Canada. And they also needed ballast for keeping the boats down when they were going out empty. So then the landlords copped on as well, and they thought, God, you know, it's actually cheaper to assist someone to emigrate and get rid of the problem than it is to try and deal with it here.
Between 1845 and 1850, during the period of the Great Potato Famine, 1.5 million people would leave Ireland looking for a better life in North America. During this period, especially in 1847, when mass emigration began, Ships like this that you're on at the moment, the Jeannie Johnston, was the type of ship that would carry these people across the Atlantic. And the average voyage of an emigrant ship during that period was between 4 and 6 weeks. We look back at the Jeannie Johnston making 16 emigrant voyages between 1848 and 1855 and carrying an average of 200 passengers per voyage. Of course, in 1847, with huge outbreaks of disease on board these ships, especially the likes of cholera and typhus, up to 50,000 people would either die on board emigrant ships or in quarantine on arrival. Of course, emigrant ships did become known as coffin ships because of the amount of people that were dying on board, literally describing them as one large wooden coffin. And on some ships, you know, we're talking a 75% death rate. I can tell you one ship in particular where out of 200 people, about 193 died on board. But the amazing thing about the Jeannie Johnston is that out of the 16 voyages made, not one life was lost. And this really was a remarkable record to have for that period of time. Life on board an emigrant ship during that period, very cramped conditions. You know, these people would have been very malnourished coming on board. And of course, a very important thing was, you know, they provided enough food. We look back at many emigrant ships and a lot of them were treated as cargo. If they didn't have a good captain and not providing enough food, or you might often read about captains cutting the rations to save costs. I read not so long ago myself of one captain who had loaded his ship with rotten corn from New Orleans to feed his passengers. If they were malnourished coming on board, they of course would be prone to these diseases. The whole voyage was an issue as well. I mean, you know, depending on weather conditions, the likes of these ships, the Jeannie Johnston, for example, did 2 voyages a year, normally in April and August. And of course, you weren't always guaranteed good weather. For example, in 1853, the Jeannie Johnston had to pay an unannounced visit into St Andrews, New Brunswick, rather than go on to its final destination of Quebec. And this was because of bad weather conditions. The master, James Attridge, who was from Cork, he got mostly written consent from the majority of passengers to make this unannounced visit. And of course, we look at these people that were on that voyage looking for a better life. 53 of those people remained on in St Andrews, New Brunswick, because they were promised work on the railroads there. Unfortunately, that work never came. And a lot of them had to walk to Portland, Maine in the cold of winter to go on into the US looking for work. The Jeannie Johnston made 16 emigrant voyages. The original ship was built in Quebec in Canada in 1847, and it was sold then to a company called John Donovan and Sons in 1848 from Tralee. Nicholas Donovan was the owner of the ship, and of course his trade was lumber from Canada. He had a flour and sawmill in Tralee as well, but of course, like other ship owners, he would go on and use it as an emigrant ship as well. On the first voyage in 1848, there was a Daniel and Margaret O'Reilly on board, and they boarded the ship on the 23rd of April. Margaret was heavily pregnant when she boarded, so it would show the confidence of the good doctor that they had on the Jeannie Johnston. You know, he knew the child was going to be born on board, just didn't know it was going to happen so quickly. She gave birth on the 24th of April, and the ship left just after. So of course they'd nearly 6 weeks ahead of them with their newborn son. And the amazing thing is, on the journey over, they decided they would name him after the ship owner and the entire crew. So he would end up with one of the longest names in history. That child's name is Nicholas James Richard Thomas John Michael Edward Alexander Archibald Arthur Hugh William Cornelius Gabriel Samuel Parabaret Carls John Johnston O'Reilly. Now, of course, on the US Census in 1850, it's just recorded as Nicholas Johnston Riley. The amazing thing about the census, though, is where it says birthplace, it's recorded the Atlantic Ocean. And just over a year ago, we actually had a visit of the great-grandson of this child that was born on board, John O'Reilly, who lives in a place called Fergus Falls in Minnesota, and that's where Nicholas had settled. Okay, well, we talk about the average fare, probably around £4. The Jeannie Johnston was £3.10 shillings. Now, of course, when we say an average of £4, we're talking close to half a year's wage for these poor farmers of the time. And a lot of people do ask, you know, how did they afford to travel? A lot of it turned out to be assisted emigration, whether they had family members there already, you know, hoping to send passage home, landlords paying passage just to clear these poor farmers from their lands, and indentured servitude. But of course, signing into indentured servitude, a lot of these people didn't know what they were signing themselves into, and the average servitude in the US was 7 or 8 years.